Hey guys, I'm Aaron and I'm going to be doing the renewed devotional for this week. So the question today, or like the topic for this week, is where do you run? If we take a minute to really examine the question, we can really pose two different questions. Where do you run to, or where do you run from? And both of these questions we can answer God, right? So if we can take a closer look at that later after I read the portion for our devotional. Today we'll be focusing on 1 Corinthians 9 verses 24. I'm going to be reading from ESV. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. First and foremost, we can see a couple of key things within the verse itself. We can see an actual race where people are running, a runner, and one that's receiving the prize, right? Definitely we've all encountered an experience or some type of scenario where there was something that a bunch of people were competing for and one person received a prize at the end, right? So how do you think we feel once we get that prize or we receive some type of reward? Happy, right? We'll be joyous because you received the fruit of your labor. You put in all that determination, that time, that effort to receive the prize at the end, right? So what do you think Paul might be saying with this chapter? For that, we need to look into more context where we read a little bit more earlier and after the verse to really understand what Paul is saying. Earlier in the chapter, we see in verses 16 and 17, Paul says, For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. In just these verses alone, we can see that Paul admits to preaching the gospel as his sole duty. Paul says, and Paul references this idea of him being rewarded for doing the necessity that is laid upon him. With this in mind, we can see and we can say that Paul believes in Jesus Christ and he wants everyone and all people to believe in Christ themselves. Paul describes this as the race that he'll do anything to receive the prize and reach the finish line. Paul runs deeper and says later in the chapter in verse 20, to the Jews I become as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under law I became as one under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. We can see repetitively Paul repeating the phrase to win, to win, to win. We can see Paul kind of connects with the different people, the weak with the weak, strong with the strong Jews. He becomes as a Jew to win the Jews, right? We could see, but the common theme among all of this is that he does it for the sake of the gospel, right? So with that being in mind, with having all of that in mind, Paul does whatever to win that race. We can see that determination, that strive, that push that Paul has to win the race, right? So with all this in mind, and I threw so much context at you, what does the verse that we initially talked about really mean to this chapter? If you forgot the verse, I'll reread it. It says, Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run so that you may obtain it. We as the people of God are always running in a spiritual race and aiming for the finish line. The finish line, obviously, we all know is heaven, right? We all want to get to heaven. As a person that may compete in a race, we see they put determination, they put effort so that they receive the prize, right? We as Christians have to look at our lives as a race to get to heaven, and we have to put in that effort to get to that prize. Paul forgets everything in life and surrenders to Christ to show us the perfect example of how we should ourselves commit to Jesus. The chapter is even named Paul's surrendering his rights. He surrenders everything so that he himself commits to Christ and so that he brings others to Christ, right? I'm not saying we have to be like Paul and do things like becoming weak or becoming strong to show our commitment to Christ, but we have to surrender some stuff so that we aim for that prize, right? There's a hymn that we all know, and it goes as, when we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we will sing and shout the victory, right? So Jesus wants all of us to sing and shout the victory, and the race, and this is a race where many people can be the winners. This is one of the only races where many people can be the winners of the same prize. We just all have to be up for it. Now, with all that being said, our topic for Renew, as I said earlier, is where do you run? I asked this question earlier, and I also said, where do you run to or where do you run from? We now know that the answer is that we shouldn't run from God, but we should run to God and receive our prize. Thank you so much.